London, 1818. They say that love and business should never mix. I believed that with every fibre of my being. I, Lady Georgiana Hartwell, never imagined that a document with carefully worded clauses would become both my salvation and my undoing. That a marriage built on financial necessity would challenge everything I thought I knew about the human heart. That paragraph 4 of a legal contract would haunt me in ways I never anticipated. But what I really didn't know is that the heart refuses to be bound by ink and parchment. This is the story of a woman who accepted a loveless marriage to save her family from ruin, and discovered that some agreements are meant to be broken. But before we dive into this story that challenges everything society tells us about duty and desire, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Because this journey promises to be unforgettable. The truth is always more fascinating than fiction. I have always prided myself on being a practical woman. Perhaps it was growing up in Hartwell Manor, watching the paint peel from the walls year after year, while my mother smiled bravely at every tradesman we could no longer afford to pay. Perhaps it was the way my father's gambling debts became whispered scandals in drawing rooms across Hampshire. Or perhaps it was simply the cold reality of being a 23-year-old woman with an ancient name and absolutely nothing else to recommend her in the marriage market. Whatever the reason, I learned early that sentimentality was a luxury I could not afford, so when my mother sat me down in our shabby morning room on that grey March afternoon, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea into chipped porcelain cups, I already knew what she was going to say. I had known for months, really, watching our situation grow more desperate with each passing week. She spoke of duty, of family, of the fortunate opportunity that had presented itself through her distant cousin, Lady Pemberton, who moved in circles far above our current station. There was a gentleman, she said, her voice carefully neutral, a very distinguished gentleman, the Duke of Stirling to be precise. I had heard of him, of course. Everyone in England had heard of Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Stirling. At 32, he was one of the wealthiest and most influential peers in the realm. His estate sprawled across 3 counties. His investments in shipping and railways had multiplied his already considerable fortune, and most notably, he had remained stubbornly unmarried despite a decade of ambitious mothers throwing their daughters in his path. The rumours about him were varied and contradictory. Some said he was cold and calculating, incapable of genuine emotion. Others whispered of scandals carefully hushed, of a heart broken in his youth that had turned him cynical and remote. A few brave souls suggested he simply preferred his independence to the complications of matrimony. What everyone agreed upon was that the Duke of Stirling was not a romantic prospect. He was a business proposition. My mother explained the situation with admirable directness. The Duke needed a wife to silence certain rumours and to solidify his position in political circles, where a bachelor of his age was viewed with increasing suspicion. He wanted someone respectable, well-bred, and most importantly, someone who would not have unrealistic expectations about the nature of their union. In return, he was prepared to be extraordinarily generous. My family's debts would be cleared immediately. Hartwell Manor would be restored. My younger sister would have a proper dowry. My mother would live in comfort for the remainder of her days. All I had to do was marry a man I had never met and accept that our relationship would be purely transactional. I agreed before she had finished outlining the terms. What else could I do? Watch my sister's prospects crumble, along with our home? Let my mother worry herself into an early grave? Pride, I had learned, was another luxury reserved for those who could afford it. The meeting was arranged for the following week at Lady Pemberton's townhouse in Mayfair. I wore my best dress, which I knew was woefully outdated, and tried not to feel like cattle being presented at market. He arrived precisely on time, because of course he did. The Duke of Stirling struck me immediately as a man who had never been late for anything in his life. Tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored coat of midnight blue, he moved with the unconscious authority of someone who had never questioned his right to command any room he entered. His features were striking rather than handsome in the conventional sense. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, and those remarkable eyes, a grey so light they were almost silver in certain lights. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing a broad forehead and an expression of polite indifference that I suspected was his habitual mask. We were introduced. He bowed. I curtsied. Lady Pemberton, reading the situation with admirable tact, invented an excuse to give us privacy. The Duke wasted no time on pleasantries. He informed me that he had made inquiries about my family and found our circumstances to be as Lady Pemberton had represented. He understood that I was educated, well-mannered, and capable of conducting myself appropriately in society. These qualities, he said in a tone that suggested he was discussing the purchase of a horse, would suit his purposes admirably. He then produced a document from his coat pocket. A marriage contract, he explained, that would govern the terms of our union. His solicitor had prepared it with meticulous attention to detail. He suggested I read it carefully before making any decision. I took the papers with hands that I refused to let shake. The document was indeed thorough. It outlined financial arrangements, property rights, expectations for public appearances, and provisions for any potential children. Each paragraph was more coldly practical than the last, but it was paragraph 4 that I found myself reading over and over. Both parties agree to maintain conduct of mutual courtesy without demands of an intimate nature or expectations of affection. The words were so clinical, so utterly devoid of anything resembling human warmth, that I almost laughed. This was to be my marriage, a business arrangement with built-in emotional protection. No messy feelings, no disappointed hopes, no pretense that this was anything other than what it was. I looked up to find him watching me with those pale grey eyes. His expression revealed nothing. He asked if I had any questions about the terms. Only one question mattered, really. I asked him directly why he had chosen this path, why a man of his position and wealth would settle for such a cold arrangement, rather than seeking a love match. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Not quite emotion, but perhaps the shadow of it. He told me that he had learned through experience that romantic expectations led only to disappointment and complications. He had no interest in the games people played in the name of courtship. He wanted clarity, honesty, and mutual benefit. He asked if I found such honesty offensive. I told him I found it refreshing. A marriage based on realistic expectations, rather than romantic delusions, seemed infinitely preferable to the alternative. I had seen what happened when people married for love. My own parents had been a cautionary tale. My father had adored my mother, but his love had not prevented him from gambling away her dowry or drinking himself to death when the debts became overwhelming. At least this way, I knew exactly what I was getting. Security, stability, a clearly defined role, with no confusion about expectations or obligations. The Duke seemed satisfied with my response. He asked if I needed time to consider his offer or to consult with my family. I told him that would not be necessary. I accepted his terms. We shook hands like business partners concluding a transaction. His grip was firm and brief. He informed me that his secretary would contact me regarding arrangements for the ceremony. He preferred something small and efficient. I assured him I had no desire for an elaborate wedding. He bowed again, I curtsied again, and then he was gone, leaving me alone with the contract and the strange hollow feeling in my chest that I refused to acknowledge. I read paragraph 4 one more time before folding the document carefully and tucking it into my reticule. Both parties agreed to maintain conduct of mutual courtesy without demands of an intimate nature or expectations of affection. It seemed so simple, so civilized, so perfectly rational. I had no way of knowing that those carefully chosen words would come to haunt me in ways I could never have anticipated. That a contract designed to protect us both would become the very thing that made everything so impossibly complicated. But that understanding would come later. That afternoon, I simply returned home to inform my mother that I had agreed to become the Duchess of Stirling and that our troubles were finally over. I believed that completely. I believed that I had made a practical choice that would benefit everyone involved. I believed that I was perfectly capable of living within the emotional boundaries that paragraph 4 so clearly established. I believed that my heart would cooperate with the terms I had agreed to. How magnificently, spectacularly wrong I was. The wedding took place on a grey April morning that seemed determined to match the businesslike nature of the occasion. Rain misted against the windows of the small chapel, and the handful of witnesses, my mother, my sister Charlotte, Lady Pemberton, and the Duke's solicitor, sat in sombre rows that emphasized just how unromantic this union truly was. I wore a dress that my mother had insisted was appropriate for a ducal wedding, though we both knew it was the best we could afford, rather than what was truly fitting. Pale ivory silk that had been her own wedding gown, altered to fit my smaller frame. Charlotte had woven orange blossoms into my hair with trembling fingers, tears streaming down her face, despite my reassurances that this was exactly what I wanted. The Duke arrived precisely on time, dressed in formal black that made him look even more imposing than usual. When he took my hand to lead me to the altar, his touch was impersonal and brief. We spoke our vows in clear, steady voices. There was no tremor of emotion, no meaningful glances, no suggestion that this was anything other than a legal proceeding. When the vicar pronounced us man and wife, Alexander, I supposed I should think of him by his given name now, placed a perfunctory kiss on my cheek. His lips were cool, and the contact lasted less than a second. Then it was done. I was the Duchess of Stirling. The breakfast afterward was equally efficient, polite conversation about the weather and upcoming parliamentary sessions. My mother's brave smile as she accepted the Duke's, my husband's, assurance that Hartwell Manor would be attended to immediately. Charlotte's wide-eyed awe at the sheer wealth on display, even in this modest gathering. By noon, I was installed in an elegant carriage bearing the Stirling coat of arms, travelling north toward Derbyshire and my new life. Alexander rode beside the carriage on a magnificent black horse, preferring the exercise to sitting beside his new wife, I told. Myself, I was relieved by this arrangement. Stirling House revealed itself at sunset, emerging from the Derbyshire hills like something from a Gothic novel. Vast and imposing, built of grey stone that glowed almost silver in the fading light, it made Hartwell Manor look like a gardener's cottage by comparison. The grounds stretched as far as I could see, impeccably maintained gardens giving way to parkland and woods beyond. The staff assembled to greet us numbered more than 30. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, was a stout woman with kind eyes and a capable manner that immediately put me at ease. She informed me that she had taken the liberty of preparing the Duchess's suite in the East Wing, as was traditional. Alexander barely glanced at me as he confirmed these arrangements. He informed Mrs. Davies that he would occupy his usual chambers in the West Wing, and that I should be given complete freedom to arrange the household as I saw fit. Then he disappeared into his study, leaving me to navigate my first evening as Duchess of Stirling without him. Thus began our carefully choreographed existence. For 3 months, the Duke of Stirling and I were the model of perfect commercial efficiency. He gained the wife appropriate to his social position. I gained the security of a roof that would not collapse over my head, and the knowledge that my family was finally safe from financial ruin. Our interactions followed a pattern so precise it could have been written into the contract itself. Every morning I took breakfast in the sunny morning room overlooking the rose garden. Alexander appeared at exactly 8:30, nodded in acknowledgement of my presence, helped himself to coffee and toast from the sideboard, and read the Times in silence while I pretended to be absorbed in my correspondence. We might exchange a comment about the weather. He might mention if he would be dining at home or at his club. I might inform him of any social obligations that required our joint attendance. These conversations were brief, polite, and utterly devoid of personal content. Afternoons I spent managing the household, exploring the extensive library, or receiving calls from the local gentry who were curious about the new Duchess. Alexander spent his days attending to estate business, visiting his steward, or travelling to London for parliamentary sessions. Dinners were slightly more elaborate performances. We sat at opposite ends of an absurdly long dining table, making occasional observations about the quality of the soup or the success of some business venture. Sometimes we discussed books, discovering a shared appreciation for history and philosophy. These conversations were the closest we came to genuine interaction, but even they maintained careful boundaries. After dinner, we retreated to separate drawing rooms. I played the pianoforte or worked on embroidery. He read or attended to correspondence. By 10 o'clock, we each retired to our respective wings of the house, and the distance between the east and west wings might as well have been an ocean. We shared a surname but never the same side of the bed, just as paragraph 4 had promised. I told myself I was content with this arrangement. After all, I had known exactly what I was agreeing to. There were no disappointments, because there had been no expectations. Alexander was perfectly courteous, genuinely generous with household expenses, and never made demands of any kind. I read that paragraph 4 so many times I could recite it in my sleep. Both parties agreed to maintain conduct of mutual courtesy without demands of an intimate nature or expectations of affection. It became my shield, my protection against the small, treacherous voice in my head that occasionally wondered what it might be like if our marriage were real. Society seemed satisfied with our performance. We attended the necessary balls and dinners, presenting ourselves as a properly matched couple. Alexander was, solicitous in public, offering his arm, ensuring I was introduced to the right people, seeing to my comfort with the same efficient attention he gave to all his responsibilities. Lady Victoria Pembroke, a stunning beauty with mahogany hair and sharp green eyes, seemed particularly interested in observing our interactions. She had been introduced to me as a family friend, someone who had known Alexander since childhood. The way she watched us made me vaguely uncomfortable, though I could not have explained why. At one musicale, she cornered me during the intermission and remarked on how well suited Alexander and I appeared. Her smile was perfectly pleasant, but something in her eyes suggested she found our marriage amusing in some private way. I thanked her politely and excused myself, unsettled by the encounter without understanding the reason. But these were minor disturbances in an otherwise smoothly functioning arrangement. I managed the household with growing confidence. The staff respected me. The estate ran efficiently. Alexander seemed satisfied with his bargain. I convinced myself that I was equally satisfied. The problem was the small moments that refused to fit neatly into our contractual framework. The way I found myself listening for his footsteps in the corridor, even though I knew his schedule kept him far from the East Wing. The unexpected pleasure I felt on the rare occasions when he chose to dine at home rather than at his club. The way my traitorous heart would skip when he smiled, not the polite public smile, but the rare, genuine expression that occasionally appeared when something in our dinner conversation amused him. I noticed things I should not have noticed. The way he took his coffee, black with no sugar, very hot. The slight furrow between his brows when he was concentrating on correspondence. The fact that he preferred historical biographies to novels, though he never dismissed my own preference for fiction as frivolous. These observations felt dangerous, like small cracks forming in the protective wall I had built around my emotions. I reminded myself constantly of paragraph 4. No demands, no expectations, no affection. But the heart, as I was beginning to discover, pays remarkably little attention to contractual obligations. 3 months into our marriage, I believed I had mastered the art of being the Duchess of Stirling. I knew my role. I performed it well. I kept my inappropriate feelings carefully contained and told myself that this vague sense of loneliness was simply the price of security. I had no idea that everything was about to change. I had no idea that a rainy Tuesday afternoon would shatter the careful distance we had maintained. I had no idea that paragraph 4, which I had relied upon as my emotional armor, was about to become completely and utterly irrelevant. But that understanding would come soon enough. For now, I simply continued our perfectly choreographed dance. 2 strangers, sharing a magnificent house and a legal contract, pretending that this cold arrangement was exactly what we both wanted. The rain continued to fall outside Stirling House, and I sat in my drawing room working on embroidery I did not care about, trying very hard not to wonder what my husband was doing in the West Wing, and why the distance between us suddenly felt less like protection and more like punishment. 3 months of perfect commercial efficiency, 3 months of carefully maintained boundaries, 3 months of telling myself that this was enough. I should have known that nothing built on such rigid control could last forever. I should have known that the human heart refuses to be managed like a business transaction. But I was still learning these lessons, and the education I was about to receive would be far more devastating than anything I had anticipated when I signed that contract and agreed to paragraph 4. It was a Tuesday. I remember that detail with perfect clarity because Tuesdays were when Mrs. Davies and I reviewed the household accounts. A mundane task that I had come to appreciate for its orderly predictability. Everything in my new life ran on schedules and routines, and I had learned to find comfort in that structure. The morning had been unremarkable. Alexander and I had performed our usual breakfast ritual. Polite nods, weather commentary, the rustling of newspapers. He mentioned he would be at his club for most of the day, and would likely dine there as well. I acknowledged this information with practiced indifference, though I felt an irrational stab of disappointment that I immediately suppressed. By afternoon, clouds had rolled in from the north, turning the sky the colour of pewter. Rain began as a light mist and gradually intensified until it drummed against the windows with insistent rhythm. I found myself repeatedly distracted from the accounts, staring out at the grey landscape and feeling inexplicably melancholy. Mrs. Davies noticed my distraction and kindly suggested we continue our review the following day. I agreed, relieved to escape the suffocating confines of routine for a few hours. I retreated to the library, thinking I might lose myself in a novel. The library at Stirling House was magnificent. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, comfortable chairs positioned near tall windows, and a fireplace large enough to stand in. It had quickly become my favourite room in the house, a sanctuary where I could forget the peculiar loneliness of my situation. I was examining the poetry section, running my fingers along the spines of volumes by Byron and Wordsworth, when I heard the front door open and close. Footsteps in the hall, Alexander's voice speaking to Daniels, the butler. My heart performed an absurd little leap that I firmly told myself was mere surprise. He was not supposed to be home. Our schedule did not include unexpected returns. I told myself to stay in the library. There was no reason to seek him out. We would see each other at breakfast tomorrow, and that was perfectly adequate. But somehow, I found myself drifting toward the doorway, drawn by a curiosity I refused to examine too closely. He appeared at the end of the corridor, walking toward his study. The sight of him stopped me in my tracks. Alexander's hair, usually so perfectly arranged, was slightly dishevelled by the wind and rain. Dark strands had fallen across his forehead, softening the severe lines of his face. His greatcoat of deep blue velvet bore visible marks of rain on the shoulders and sleeves, darkening the fabric in irregular patterns. He carried his gloves and hat in one hand, and there was something almost vulnerable about his appearance, something human and real that our carefully maintained distance usually obscured. He looked up and saw me standing there. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, across the expanse of polished floor. Then he smiled, not the polite public smile I had grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more genuine, something that made my breath catch, in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. He explained that a matter at the club had been resolved more quickly than anticipated. The weather had turned poor. It seemed more sensible to return home rather than wait out the storm in town. I murmured something about the accounts being finished early as well, feeling absurdly self-conscious. We stood there in awkward silence for several heartbeats. Then, because the universe apparently had a sense of irony, we both moved simultaneously toward the small table, where afternoon tea had been laid out. Our hands met as we reached for the same delicate china teacup. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. His fingers were warm against mine. I felt the touch like an electric shock running up my arm and settling somewhere in the vicinity of my chest. I jerked my hand back as if burned, and the cup rattled dangerously on its saucer. Alexander steadied it with his other hand, and for those brief moments, we were both touching the same cup, our hands nearly overlapping, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He held my gaze. Those pale grey eyes that I had thought cold and distant were anything but. There was something in them, curiosity perhaps, or confusion, or something else entirely that I dared not name. The moment stretched. 2 seconds became 3, then 4, far longer than was appropriate or necessary, far longer than paragraph 4 of our contract would have deemed acceptable. When he finally released the cup and stepped back, I felt the loss of his proximity like a physical ache. He apologized for his clumsiness. I assured him it was entirely my fault. We were both lying, and we both knew it. The afternoon tea suddenly seemed like a ridiculous idea. I made some excuse about needing to write letters and fled to the morning room like a coward, my heart pounding so hard I was certain he must have heard it. I sat at my writing desk, staring at blank paper, trying desperately to compose myself. This was absurd, completely and utterly absurd. We had touched hands reaching for a teacup, nothing more. It was hardly the stuff of Gothic novels. There was no reason for my pulse to be racing, or for my skin to still feel warm where his fingers had brushed mine. I reminded myself of paragraph 4. I recited it in my head like a prayer or a ward against dark magic. Both parties agree to maintain conduct of mutual courtesy without demands of an intimate nature or expectations of affection. No expectations of affection. That was the agreement. That was what I had signed. That was what kept this arrangement safe and manageable. But as I sat there, listening to the rain against the windows, and knowing that Alexander was somewhere in this vast house, instead of safely distant at his club, I felt something shift inside me. Something I had been carefully suppressing for 3 months cracked open, and the truth spilled out. The problem with contracts, I realized with growing horror, is that they are written with ink on parchment. They are logical and rational and designed by human minds to govern human behavior. But the heart, the heart is made of something far less predictable. Something that refuses to be bound by carefully worded clauses and mutual agreements. Something that insists on feeling regardless of what legal documents might say. I thought about the past 3 months, all the small moments I had dismissed as insignificant. The way I listened for his voice in the morning, the disappointment when he dined at his club, the pleasure when he chose to spend an evening at home. The way his rare smiles affected me far more than they should. These were not the reactions of a woman satisfied with a purely business arrangement. These were the reactions of someone who had done the very thing paragraph 4 explicitly forbade. I had developed expectations. I had begun to want affection where none was promised or appropriate. And that brief touch of his hand on mine had evaporated whatever protection the contract had offered. Like morning mist burned away by sunlight, paragraph 4 had simply dissolved, leaving me exposed and vulnerable to feelings I had no right to have. I looked down at my hands, still trembling slightly. I thought about Alexander in his study, probably already absorbed in estate business, completely unaffected by our encounter. Why would he be affected? He had made it perfectly clear what he wanted from this marriage, and it certainly was not emotional complications. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows. I picked up my pen and attempted to write a letter to my mother, but the words would not come. My mind was too full of silver-grey eyes and dishevelled dark hair, and the ghost of warmth where our hands had, touched. I told myself this was temporary madness brought on by the dreary weather and the unexpected disruption of our routine. By tomorrow, everything would return to normal. We would resume our careful dance of polite distance. I would lock these inappropriate feelings away where they belonged. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew I was lying, because now I had seen him differently. Not as the cold, distant duke who had proposed a business arrangement, but as Alexander, a man who got caught in the rain, whose hair fell across his forehead, who had held my gaze 2 seconds longer than necessary, and had perhaps, possibly, felt something in that moment too. And that knowledge changed everything. I sat in the morning room as afternoon faded to evening, watching the rain and wrestling with the devastating realization that I had failed at the one task our marriage required of me. I was supposed to maintain emotional distance. I was supposed to be satisfied with security and uncomfort. I was supposed to keep my heart safely guarded behind the walls of our contract. Instead, I had done something monumentally foolish. I had begun to care for my husband, not the distant respect one might have for a business partner, not the gratitude for his generosity to my family, but something deeper, more dangerous, more impossible. I thought I was safe behind clauses and seals of wax. I thought paragraph 4 would protect me from exactly this situation. But now, as I sat alone in the gathering darkness, I realized that no contract in the world could have prevented what was happening to my treacherous heart. The contract said we were partners in a mutually beneficial arrangement. My racing pulse, my trembling hands, my inability to think about anything except the way he had looked at me across that teacup. All of it insisted we were something far more dangerous. And I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. Dinner that evening was torture. Alexander appeared, precisely on time, impeccably dressed once again, his hair perfectly arranged, as if the dishevelled version from the afternoon had been a fever dream. We took our usual positions at opposite ends of the absurdly long table, but nothing was the same. I was acutely aware of every movement he made, the way he held his wine glass, the furrow between his brows as he considered the fish course, the occasional glances he sent in my direction when he thought I was not looking, or perhaps I was imagining those glances. Perhaps I was projecting my own confused feelings onto him, seeing things that were not there because I desperately wanted them to exist. We discussed a book we had both read. His observations were intelligent and thoughtful as always. I managed to contribute coherently to the conversation, though my mind was only half focused on literary criticism. The other half was consumed with watching him from across the table, wondering what he was thinking, wishing I could ask the questions that paragraph 4 made impossible. When we finally retired for the evening, I lay awake in my chambers in the East Wing, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was doing the same in the West Wing, wondering if that moment with the teacup had affected him at all, wondering if I was completely alone in this sudden, overwhelming awareness, wondering how I was supposed to continue our carefully choreographed existence, now that everything had changed, at least for me. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world washed clean and impossibly green. But the clarity it brought to the landscape did nothing to clarify my confused heart. I had 3 months of practice maintaining emotional distance. Surely I could continue. Surely I could push these feelings back down and resume the safe, manageable existence we had established. But as I prepared to face another day, another breakfast, another performance of polite indifference, I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted. The contract might say we were business partners, but my heart had other ideas entirely. And paragraph 4, for all its careful legal language, was proving to be absolutely useless against the relentless, irrational, wonderful and terrible thing that was beginning to bloom in my chest every time I thought about Alexander Blackwood. I was in trouble. Deep, complicated, heartbreaking trouble. And I had no idea how this story would end. The morning after the teacup incident, as I had begun thinking of it in the privacy of my own mind, I descended to breakfast, determined to prove that nothing had changed. I would be perfectly composed, perfectly polite, perfectly indifferent. Alexander was already there, reading the Times as usual. He glanced up when I entered, offering the same polite nod he always did. For a moment, I felt relieved. Perhaps I had imagined the entire thing. Perhaps it had been only my own confused feelings creating significance where none existed. Then our eyes met, and I saw something flicker across his face. Brief, quickly suppressed, but unmistakably there. Recognition, perhaps, or awareness. Something that suggested yesterday's moment had not been entirely one-sided. He looked away first, returning his attention to the newspaper, with what seemed like deliberate focus. I helped myself to tea and toast, my hands mercifully steady, and took my usual seat. The silence stretched between us, but it felt different now, charged with something I could not name. I tried to read a letter from my mother, but the words blurred on the page. I was too aware of him sitting across from me, too conscious of every small sound, the rustle of paper, the quiet clink of his cup against the saucer, his occasional soft breath. This was going to be impossible. But I had agreed to this arrangement. I had signed the contract. I would simply have to find a way to manage these inconvenient feelings until they faded back into the comfortable numbness I had maintained for 3 months. Except they did not fade. If anything, they intensified with each passing day, fed by observations I could no longer prevent myself from making. I noticed, for instance, that Alexander took his coffee very hot and very black, without sugar or cream. This was not new information. I had observed it dozens of times during our breakfasts. But now I found myself wondering why. Had he always preferred it that way, or was it an affectation acquired at university? Did he even like coffee, or was it simply habit? I noticed that he had a small scar above his left eyebrow, barely visible, but there nonetheless. How had he acquired it? A childhood accident? A riding mishap? I would never ask, of course, but the question nagged at me. I noticed the way he held his pen when writing, the slight leftward slant of his handwriting visible when I occasionally glimpsed his correspondence. I noticed that he preferred historical biographies to novels, but that there was a complete collection of Shakespeare on the shelf nearest his favourite library chair, the bindings worn enough to suggest frequent reading. I noticed that when he was concentrating on estate business, a small furrow appeared between his brows. That when something in our dinner conversation genuinely amused him, his eyes lightened to almost pure silver. That he had a habit of running his hand through his hair when frustrated, which explained the occasional disarray I had witnessed. These observations felt dangerous, intimate, like I was collecting pieces of him without permission, building a portrait of the man behind the title, the person beneath the careful control. But I could not stop myself. Worse, I began to notice the way he looked at me. It started small. A glance that lasted a fraction too long as I entered the breakfast room. His eyes following me when I crossed to examine a book in the library. The slight tension in his jaw when Mr. Hartley, a neighbouring gentleman, paid me excessive attention at a dinner party we attended. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was seeing what I wanted to see, rather than what was actually there, but then there were the thoughtful gestures that had nothing to do with our contractual obligations. One morning I came down to breakfast to find a new book beside my plate, a volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry that I had mentioned admiring several days earlier in passing conversation. There was no note, no acknowledgement, just the book, clearly purchased and placed there deliberately. When I looked up, Alexander was absorbed in his newspaper, giving no indication that he had any knowledge of the book's appearance. But I caught the faintest hint of colour on his cheekbones, and I knew. Another day, I mentioned during dinner that I found the morning room rather cold in the early hours. The next morning, I discovered that a fire had been lit there before dawn. When I thanked Alexander for the consideration, he merely said that he had instructed the staff to ensure all rooms were properly heated. His tone was matter-of-fact, but he did not quite meet my eyes. He began choosing to dine at home more frequently. Not every night, that would have been too obvious, but perhaps 3 or 4 times a week, rather than his previous habit of dining at his club nearly every evening. Our dinner conversations grew longer, more engaging. We discovered shared opinions on political matters, debated historical interpretations, argued playfully about the merits of various poets. Sometimes we talked until the candles burned low and the servants began to look weary. He asked about my family, about my childhood at Hartwell Manor, about my sister Charlotte, and her progress in finding a suitable match now that her dowry was secure. His questions seemed genuinely interested, rather than merely polite. I found myself telling him things I had not planned to share. About my father's decline and death. About the helplessness of watching our situation deteriorate year by year. About the guilt I still carried for feeling relieved when our marriage solved problems I could not have resolved on my own. He listened without judgment. Sometimes he shared fragments of his own story in return, carefully selected pieces that suggested a childhood more lonely than privileged, a father whose expectations had been impossible to meet, a mother who had died when he was quite young. These conversations felt like small acts of rebellion against paragraph 4. We were not supposed to know each other this way. We were not supposed to care about each other's histories or thoughts or feelings. But knowledge, once gained, could not be unlearned, and caring, once started, seemed impossible to stop. I began to dread and anticipate our encounters in equal measure. Each breakfast was a study in restraint. Each dinner conversation pushed against the boundaries we had established. Each chance meeting in the corridors of Stirling House felt charged with unspoken questions. The worst moments were when we accidentally touched, his hand steadying my elbow when I stumbled slightly on a garden path. Our shoulders brushing as we both reached for the same book in the library. The brief contact of our fingers when he handed me into the carriage before a social engagement. Each touch, however innocent, sent electricity racing through my body. Each time, I saw something flicker in his eyes that suggested he felt it too, but we never spoke of it. We maintained the fiction that everything was exactly as it should be. Two people fulfilling the terms of a mutually beneficial contract. Nothing more. I thought I was managing adequately. I thought I was keeping my feelings hidden, maintaining the appropriate distance. Then came the evening that shattered my illusions completely. We had attended a reception at Lord and Lady Morrison's townhouse. It was a crush of people, too warm and too loud, but socially necessary. Alexander had been attentive in his usual public way, ensuring I was introduced properly, fetching refreshments, standing beside me at appropriate intervals. Lord Hartfield, a widower in his 50s, with a reputation for pursuing young women, had cornered me near the refreshment table. His conversation was ostensibly about art, but his eyes kept drifting to places they should not have been. His hand had found its way to my arm, his grip just slightly, too familiar. I was preparing a polite but firm extraction when Alexander appeared at my side with the silent efficiency of a striking hawk. His hand settled on the small of my back, a possessive gesture completely unlike his usual careful distance. His voice, when he addressed Lord Hartfield, was perfectly polite, but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. He expressed the hope that Lord Hartfield was not monopolising his wife's time, as he had been looking for me. Lord Hartfield retreated hastily, making excuses. Alexander's hand remained on my back for several seconds longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth of it through the silk of my gown. When I looked up at him, his jaw was tight, his eyes stormy. He asked if Lord Hartfield had been inappropriate. The concern in his voice was not the polite solicitude expected of a husband in public. It was something deeper, more personal, almost possessive. I assured him that Lord Hartfield was merely tiresome, nothing I could not handle. Alexander's expression suggested he disagreed with my assessment, but he said nothing further. His hand finally dropped from my back, and I felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. We left shortly afterward. The carriage ride home was silent, tension crackling in the air between us. I kept stealing glances at him in the dim light. His jaw remained tight, his hands clenched slightly on his knees. He stared out the window with an intensity that suggested he was seeing nothing at all. When we arrived at Stirling House, he helped me down from the carriage with more care than usual. His hands lingered on my waist for just a moment, and in the moonlight, I saw his expression, conflicted, almost pained. He bid me good night with unusual abruptness and disappeared toward his study instead of retiring to his chambers. I stood in the entrance hall, my heart pounding, trying to understand what had just happened. That protectiveness, that barely contained emotion, that moment of possessiveness so at odds with the carefully maintained distance of our arrangement. Either I was completely deluded, or Alexander was not as unaffected by our marriage as paragraph 4 suggested he should be. I retreated to my chambers, but sleep was impossible. I kept replaying the evening in my mind. The way he had appeared at my side, the steel in his voice, the warmth of his hand on my back, the tension in the carriage, the look in his eyes. These were not the actions of a man satisfied with a purely commercial arrangement. But what did they mean? Was he simply protective of his property, defending what was his by legal contract? Or was there something more? Something that suggested his feelings had evolved as dangerously as mine? I had no way of knowing. I could not ask without violating the terms of our agreement. I could not acknowledge what I was feeling without risking the fragile equilibrium we had maintained. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had been fooling myself for weeks. I had tried to convince myself that these feelings were manageable, that I could contain them, that I could continue our careful performance indefinitely. But the truth was far more devastating. I had not simply begun to care for Alexander Blackwood. I had fallen completely, irrevocably, hopelessly in love with my husband, the man who had married me for convenience, the man who had explicitly stated he wanted no affection or emotional expectations, the man who had designed our entire relationship to prevent exactly this sort of complication. I had broken every term of our unspoken agreement. I wanted things I had no right to want. I felt things I had promised not to feel. And worst of all, I was beginning to suspect, to hope, against all reason, that perhaps, possibly, I was not entirely alone in this impossible situation. That perhaps the contract that was supposed to protect us both had failed completely. That perhaps we were both struggling against feelings that paragraph 4 had been specifically designed to prevent. But hope, I was learning, was the most dangerous emotion of all. Because if I was wrong, if his protectiveness was merely duty, his thoughtfulness merely courtesy, his tension merely frustration with social obligations, then I was setting myself up for a heartbreak that no contract could have prevented and no amount of security could compensate for. I had thought I was being practical when I agreed to this marriage. I had thought I could manage my emotions like estate accounts, organized, controlled, predictable. But the heart, as I was discovering with painful clarity, refuses to be managed. And love, once it takes root, grows wild and uncontrollable, strangling everything in its path, including carefully written paragraphs that promise freedom from exactly this sort of beautiful, terrible mess. The morning after the Morrison reception, I woke with a headache and a sense of impending catastrophe that I could not quite name. Perhaps it was the weight of my recent realization that I had fallen in love with a man who had explicitly contracted against such complications. Or perhaps it was simple intuition, warning me that our carefully constructed world was about to become far more complicated. Either way, I was correct to feel apprehensive. The first sign of trouble arrived with the morning post. My mother's weekly letter, usually full of cheerful updates about Charlotte's social success and improvements to Hartwell Manor, carried an unusual undertone of concern. She mentioned almost casually that certain rumours had reached Hampshire. Nothing specific, she assured me, just whispers that the Duke of Stirling's marriage was perhaps not quite what it appeared. I read the paragraph 3 times, my stomach tightening with each repetition. Rumours, whispers, the poison of society, beginning to seep into our arrangement. I had been naive to think we could maintain our charade indefinitely without scrutiny. The Ton thrived on gossip, and a marriage as coolly conducted as ours was bound to invite speculation. At breakfast, Alexander seemed preoccupied. He barely glanced at his newspaper, his coffee growing cold while he stared at nothing in particular. I wondered if he too had received concerning correspondence, but I did not ask. That would have required a level of intimacy our arrangement did not permit. The second sign came that afternoon when Lady Pemberton called unexpectedly. She was shown into the drawing room where I was attempting to focus on embroidery, her expression troubled beneath her fashionable bonnet. After the usual pleasantries, she leaned forward with the air of someone about to deliver unwelcome news. She informed me that Lady Victoria Pembroke had been making certain insinuations at various social gatherings. Nothing overtly scandalous, she hastened to add, but implications nonetheless. Lady Victoria had been suggesting that my marriage to Alexander was a mere business transaction, that we barely spoke to each other, that the Duke maintained his bachelor habits, dining at his club most evenings, that I had trapped him into marriage to save my impoverished family, that he was even now continuing associations with women who had known him before his inconvenient marriage. Lady Pemberton watched my face carefully as she relayed this information. I maintained my composure through sheer force of will, though my hands trembled slightly on the embroidery frame. I thanked her for bringing this to my attention. I assured her, with more confidence than I felt, that gossip was inevitable, and that Alexander and I were perfectly content with our arrangement. The words tasted like ashes in my mouth. After she left, I sat alone in the drawing room, trying to process what I had learned. Lady Victoria Pembroke, the beautiful woman with mahogany hair and calculating green eyes who had watched our interactions so carefully at social events. The family friend who had known Alexander since childhood. I had sensed something off about her interest in our marriage, but I had dismissed it as idle curiosity. Now I wondered if there was more to her attention than I had realized. Had she and Alexander been more than friends? Was there some history between them that made our marriage particularly galling to her? Or was she simply one of those people who derived pleasure from creating discord? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, feeding the insecurities I had been trying so hard to suppress. Because the terrible truth was that Lady Victoria's rumours were not entirely false. Our marriage was largely a business transaction. We did barely speak beyond polite pleasantries, or at least we had until recently. Alexander had dined at his club most evenings for the first 3 months of our marriage. The only real lie was the suggestion that I had trapped him. He had proposed the arrangement. I had simply accepted it. But nuance did not matter in the court of public opinion. The rumours, once started, would grow and multiply like weeds in a garden. They would colour how society viewed us. They would make every public appearance an opportunity for speculation and judgment. Worse, they would put pressure on our arrangement in ways I was not certain it could withstand. That evening, Alexander returned home earlier than expected. I heard him speaking with Daniels in the entrance hall, his voice carrying attention I recognized all too well. He appeared in the doorway of the drawing room where I sat pretending to read. Without preamble, he asked if I had heard the rumours. I set down my book and confirmed that Lady Pemberton had called earlier to inform me of Lady Victoria's campaign. Alexander's jaw tightened. He crossed to the window, staring out at the darkening gardens with his hands clasped behind his back. The set of his shoulders suggested barely contained fury. He said with careful control that he had been informed of the situation by several concerned acquaintances. That Lady Victoria's insinuations were becoming increasingly bold. That something would need to be done to address the gossip before it spiraled further out of control. I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral, what he proposed we do. He turned to face me, and the expression in his eyes made my breath catch. There was something raw there, something that looked almost like pain beneath the anger. He said we would need to appear more convincingly attached in public, more frequent social appearances together. Visible demonstrations of affection appropriate to a devoted couple. A united front against the whispers. The word affection hung in the air between us, heavy with irony. Paragraph 4 had explicitly exempted us from any such expectations. Now circumstances were forcing us to perform exactly what we had contracted to avoid. I agreed, because what else could I do? Our reputations were at stake. My family's security depended on the success of this marriage. I could not let idle gossip destroy what we had built, even if that foundation was more fragile than I had realized. But inside, my heart was breaking. Because now every gesture of affection would be performance. Every touch would be theatre. The small moments of genuine connection we had been building, the thoughtful books, the longer dinners, the careful conversations would be tainted by obligation and public scrutiny. I would have to watch Alexander play the role of devoted husband while knowing it was merely strategy. I would have to pretend to be a woman secure in her husband's regard, while Lady Victoria's beautiful face and knowing smile reminded me of all the reasons he might regret his choice. The following weeks were an exercise in controlled misery. We attended every significant social event in London. Alexander was attentive in ways that should have delighted me, but instead felt like exquisite torture. His hand at my elbow, his body positioned protectively at my side, his eyes seeking mine across crowded rooms. All of it performance, all of it strategy, none of it real, or at least that was what I told myself. Because believing otherwise, believing that any of his attention was genuine, would have been too painful when I knew the truth of our arrangement. Lady Victoria was everywhere, it seemed, at every ball, every dinner, every musicale. She watched us with those sharp green eyes, her smile knowing and vaguely triumphant. Sometimes she made a point of approaching Alexander, touching his arm with casual familiarity, laughing at his polite responses as if they shared private jokes. I told myself I had no right to the jealousy that burned in my chest. Alexander was free to have whatever associations he chose. Paragraph 4 had guaranteed him that freedom. But watching her beautiful face turn up to his, seeing the way she looked at him with undisguised interest, knowing that she had known him long before I entered his life, it was agony. The worst was when she cornered me at Lady Hartwell's ball, her expression sympathetic in a way that felt entirely calculated. She told me, with false sweetness, that she hoped I was not too distressed by the unfortunate rumours, that she understood how difficult it must be to maintain one's dignity in such circumstances, that Alexander had always been so particular about his independence, so resistant to the constraints of marriage. She said she hoped I had not developed unrealistic expectations about the nature of my union with him, that it would be kinder to both of us if I accepted the limitations of our arrangement, rather than hoping for something more. The words were delivered with a smile, but they landed like knife blades. I thanked her for her concern with a composure I did not feel. I excused myself before she could see how deeply her words had cut. Because the terrible thing was that she was not entirely wrong. I had developed unrealistic expectations. I had hoped for something more. I had fallen in love with a man who had promised me everything except his heart. That night, I stood at the window of my chambers, looking out over the gardens of Stirling House, wrestling with despair. I could not continue this way. The performance was destroying me. Every public touch from Alexander reminded me of what I wanted and could not have. Every appearance of affection was a reminder that it was merely that, an appearance. And Lady Victoria's knowing looks, her subtle needling, her obvious history with Alexander, all of it fed the insecurity that gnawed at me constantly. Did he regret our marriage? Did he resent the restrictions it placed on him? Was there truth to the rumours about other women, other associations? Did he look at Lady Victoria and wish he had chosen differently? I had no right to ask these questions, no right to care about the answers. But I cared anyway, desperately, painfully. The next morning at breakfast, Alexander looked as exhausted as I felt. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, suggesting he had slept as poorly as I had. We sat in our usual silence, but it felt different now, heavier, weighted with all the things we could not say to each other. I found myself studying his face, trying to read his thoughts. Did he feel anything beyond frustration at this complication to our neat arrangement? Did our public performances of affection affect him at all, or was he simply going through practiced motions? He looked up suddenly, catching me watching him. Our eyes met and held. For a moment, I thought I saw something in his gaze. Longing, perhaps, or confusion, or the same desperate hope that burned in my own chest. Then he looked away, and the moment was gone. We finished our breakfast in silence. He departed for his study. I retreated to the morning room to write letters I had no interest in writing. And the rumours continued to swirl around us, growing bolder with each passing day, threatening to expose the fundamental fragility of what we had built. I had thought the greatest danger to our arrangement would be emotional attachment. I had been wrong. The greatest danger was the world outside, with its gossip and judgment, and people like Lady Victoria, who seemed determined to prove that our marriage was exactly what it appeared to be, a cold transaction that satisfied no one. And the worst part was that I could not even argue with her assessment, because what we had was a contract, a carefully worded agreement that protected us from the mess of genuine emotion. The fact that I had violated those terms, that I had fallen in love despite every protection we had put in place, did not change the fundamental nature of our arrangement. Alexander had married me for convenience. I had married him for security. The contract said we were partners. My breaking. Heart insisted we could be more. But Lady Victoria's poison was spreading through society, and I had no idea how to fight rumours that were built on uncomfortable truths. All I could do was continue the performance, smile at social events, accept Alexander's public attentions, pretend that my heart was not shattering a little more with each passing day, and wonder how long I could maintain this facade before something finally broke. The invitation to the Sterling House summer ball arrived on my writing desk one morning in early June, delivered by Mrs. Davies with an expression that suggested she anticipated my reaction. It was not technically an invitation. As the Duchess of Sterling, I was expected to host the annual event that had been a tradition for generations. What made my stomach drop was the realization that this would be our first major social event as hosts since the rumours had begun circulating. Every member of the ton would attend. They would watch us with avid curiosity, searching for evidence to support or refute Lady Victoria's insinuations. Our home would become a stage, and Alexander and I would be the primary performers in a drama we had not scripted. When I mentioned the ball to Alexander at dinner that evening, he simply nodded and said that Mrs. Davies had already begun coordinating with the staff. His tone was neutral, but I saw the tightness around his eyes that suggested he understood the implications as well as I did. We would have to be perfect, convincingly devoted, a united front against the whispers that threatened to undermine everything we had built. The irony was not lost on me. Our marriage had begun as a performance, two people pretending to be a conventional couple while maintaining emotional distance. Now we were being forced to perform affection we had explicitly contracted to avoid, all to protect an arrangement that was slowly destroying me from the inside. The weeks of preparation were a blur of activity, guest lists, menu planning, floral arrangements, musical selections. I threw myself into the work with desperate focus, grateful for any distraction from my increasingly chaotic emotions. Alexander was more present during this time than he had been in months. He consulted with me on various decisions, his input thoughtful and engaged. Sometimes our fingers would brush as we examined seating charts or approved menu options. Each accidental touch sent electricity through my body that I struggled to conceal. I caught him watching me occasionally with an expression I could not quite decipher. Intent, almost searching, as if he were trying to solve some puzzle that confounded him. Those moments gave me dangerous hope that perhaps I was not alone in my feelings. But I forced myself to remember Lady Victoria's words, the terms of our contract, the fundamental impossibility of what I wanted. The evening of the ball arrived with perfect weather, warm but not oppressive, clear skies promising a beautiful night. The house had been transformed. Thousands of candles created a golden glow throughout the public rooms. Flowers from our gardens filled every surface with colour and fragrance. The ballroom gleamed, ready to receive the cream of London society. I dressed with unusual care, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that had been made specifically for the occasion. My maid arranged my hair in an elaborate style with small diamonds, woven through the dark curls. When I examined myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the elegant woman staring back at me. I looked like a duchess. I looked like someone who belonged in Alexander's world. I wondered if he would notice. When I descended the stairs to join him in receiving guests, his reaction answered that question definitively. He stood in the entrance hall conferring with Daniels, but he looked up at the sound of my approach. His expression transformed, surprise, then something deeper that made my breath catch. He said nothing for several long seconds, simply looking at me with an intensity that made my skin warm. Then he recovered himself, offering me his arm with careful formality. But his hand trembled slightly where it touched mine, and I thought perhaps I was not the only one affected by our proximity. The guests began arriving promptly at 8 o'clock, a river of silks and jewels flowing through our entrance hall. Alexander and I stood side by side, greeting each arrival with practiced grace. His hand remained at the small of my back, a gesture of possession and protection that I told myself meant nothing beyond good performance. Lady Victoria arrived fashionably late, as I had known she would. She wore crimson silk that set off her dark hair and fair skin to devastating effect. When she greeted Alexander, her hand lingered on his arm just a moment too long, her smile intimate in a way that made my chest tight. She turned to me with false warmth, complimenting the decorations and remarking on how splendid everything looked. Her eyes, however, carried a different message, a challenge, perhaps, or anticipation of some victory she believed was inevitable. I thanked her with perfect courtesy and turned my attention to the next guests, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing how her presence unsettled me. The ball proceeded beautifully. The orchestra played expertly, the champagne flowed freely, couples swirled across the ballroom floor in patterns of light and colour. By any objective measure, the evening was a tremendous success, but I felt like I was walking through a nightmare, because everywhere I looked, I saw people watching us, assessing, judging, searching for evidence to support the rumours they had heard. Every interaction between Alexander and me was scrutinised. Every moment of distance between us was noted. We danced the opening waltz together, as was expected, his hand at my waist, my hand on his shoulder, our bodies moving in perfect synchronisation to the music. To any observer, we must have looked like a couple completely in harmony, but I could feel the tension radiating from him, the careful control in every movement, the way he would not quite meet my eyes. Or perhaps I was imagining it. Perhaps I was projecting my own desperate emotions onto him, seeing complications where there were only the practical concerns of a man managing his public image. The waltz ended. Alexander led me from the floor with perfect courtesy. Then he was claimed by various gentlemen for business discussions, and I was left to navigate the social currents alone. Lady Pemberton found me near the refreshment table and squeezed my hand sympathetically. She remarked that the evening was going splendidly and that anyone with eyes could see how well suited Alexander and I were. I appreciated her kindness, but I wondered if she truly believed her own words or if she was simply trying to bolster my confidence. The evening wore on. I danced with various gentlemen, made pleasant conversation, played the role of gracious hostess with all the skill I could muster. But I was increasingly aware of Lady Victoria circulating through the crowd, her beauty and charm drawing admiring looks wherever she went. I saw her speaking with Alexander at one point, standing too close, her hand on his arm again, her face turned up to his with that intimate smile. He was perfectly polite, but something in his body, language seemed less resistant than I would have hoped. Jealousy, sharp and painful, twisted in my chest. I forced myself to look away, to focus on my conversation with Lady Hartwell about nothing of importance. But the image burned in my mind, the beautiful, confident Lady Victoria and my husband, with their shared history and easy familiarity. The vivid reminder that I was the interloper in his life, accepted for practical reasons but never truly chosen. The confrontation came near midnight. I had retreated briefly to the terrace for air, overwhelmed by the heat and noise and the relentless performance of the evening. The night was beautiful, stars visible despite the lights from the house. I stood at the stone balustrade, breathing deeply and trying to collect myself for the remaining hours. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, expecting perhaps Lady Pemberton or another well-meaning friend. Instead, I found Lady Victoria. She approached with a glass of champagne in hand, her expression pleasant, but her eyes calculating. She remarked on what a lovely evening it was, how beautifully I had arranged everything. I thanked her cautiously, every instinct warning me that this was not a social pleasantry. She moved to stand beside me at the balustrade, looking out over the gardens. Then, in a tone of false sympathy, she said she hoped I was not finding the evening too taxing, that it must be exhausting to maintain such careful appearances. I said I did not know what she meant. She turned to face me directly, and the pleasant mask dropped. She told me, with brutal honesty, that we both knew the truth about my marriage, that everyone who mattered understood it was a business arrangement, that Alexander had married me out of obligation, not choice. She said she had known him for years, had watched him resist every attempt to trap him into matrimony, that his marriage to me had surprised everyone who understood his true nature. She suggested, with cruelty disguised as kindness, that I should not fool myself into thinking our public performances meant anything genuine, that Alexander was simply protecting his investment, that his heart, to the extent he possessed one, had never been available and never would be. Each word landed like a physical blow, but I maintained my composure through sheer force of will, refusing to let her see how deeply she had cut. I was preparing a measured response when I heard another voice behind us. Alexander stood in the terrace doorway, and the expression on his face made my blood run cold. He had clearly heard at least part of Victoria's speech. His eyes were storm grey, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. He walked toward us with deliberate steps, and Victoria's confident expression faltered slightly. What happened next was something I had never imagined in my wildest dreams. In front of anyone who might be watching from the ballroom, Alexander positioned himself between Victoria and me. His body language was protective, almost possessive. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge of steel I had never heard before. He addressed Victoria with chilling formality. He said he found her comments inappropriate and her presence on his terrace unwelcome. He suggested she return to the ballroom and consider whether she wished to remain at Stirling House for the duration of the evening. Victoria's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She attempted to recover, laughing lightly and suggesting he was being oversensitive, that she had merely been having a private conversation with his wife. Alexander's expression did not soften. He said that any conversation that distressed his wife was of concern to him, that he would not tolerate discourtesy toward the Duchess of Stirling in her own home or anywhere else. The emphasis he placed on his wife sent a thrill through me despite the awfulness of the situation. Victoria's eyes flashed with something ugly, humiliation, anger, perhaps wounded pride. She looked between us, her beautiful face twisted with emotions she no longer bothered to conceal. Then, In an act of pure spite, she raised her voice enough to carry to the people, now gathering in the terrace doorway, drawn by the obvious confrontation. She said loudly that everyone knew our marriage was a sham, that Alexander had purchased a wife to silence gossip while maintaining his actual life unchanged, that I had sold myself for financial security and a title, that our public displays of affection fooled no one with any sophistication. The silence that followed her outburst was absolute. Dozens of the Tun's most influential members stood watching, avid for scandal, waiting to see how we would respond. This was it, the moment that would define how society viewed us, the moment that would determine whether our arrangement survived or crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. I expected Alexander to respond with cold dismissal, to handle the situation with the same calculated control he brought to every aspect of his life. Instead, he did something that would be discussed in London drawing rooms for months to come. He turned to face the assembled crowd, his hand finding mine and holding it with unmistakable warmth. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night air. He said that yes, our marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, that he would not insult anyone's intelligence by denying the obvious, but that what had started as a contract had become something far more significant. He said that I had proven to be not just an appropriate wife, but an exceptional woman, that my intelligence, kindness, and strength had earned his respect and admiration, that every day spent in my company had reinforced his conviction that marrying me was the best decision he had ever made. He said that Lady Victoria's assessment was correct in one regard. Our marriage had changed his life, but not in the way she suggested. It had shown him that he was capable of caring for someone beyond mere obligation. That partnership could become something deeper. That the carefully guarded heart he had protected for so many years had found an unexpected home. Then, still holding my hand, still facing our audience of shocked observers, he turned to me. And in front of everyone who mattered in London society, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Stirling, told me that he loved me. Not in those exact words. He was far too controlled for such simple declaration. But the meaning was unmistakable. The way he looked at me, the emotion in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes as he waited for my response. Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to just his face, his hand holding mine, the impossible words he had just spoken. This was not performance. This was not strategy. This was truth, raw and real and terrifying in its honesty. Every carefully constructed wall I had built around my heart shattered in that moment. Because I saw in his eyes the mirror of my own impossible feelings, the same confusion, the same desperate hope, the same fear that caring this much was the most dangerous thing either of us could do. He had violated paragraph 4 as completely as I had. We had both fallen in love despite our best efforts to prevent it. And he had just confessed it in front of everyone who mattered, destroying any possibility of maintaining our careful pretense. I should have been terrified. Our arrangement was based on emotional distance. He had just obliterated that foundation in the most public way possible. Instead, I felt something unfurl in my chest. Joy, pure and overwhelming and unlike anything I had ever experienced. I did not care that dozens of people were watching. I did not care that we had an audience for this most private moment. I did not care about anything except the man standing before me, his hand trembling slightly in mine, waiting for my response. I told him the truth, simply. Honestly, I told him that I had been trying to honor the terms of our contract, that I had failed completely, that I had fallen in love with him despite every intention to maintain proper distance. I told him that every gesture of kindness, every thoughtful conversation, every rare smile, had made it harder to remember why I was supposed to keep my heart guarded, I told him that paragraph 4 had become meaningless the moment our hands had touched over that teacup on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Around us I heard gasps and whispers. Lady Victoria made a sound of disgust and pushed her way back through the crowd. People stared at us with varying expressions of shock, delight, and scandalous interest. I did not care about any of it because Alexander was smiling, genuinely, fully smiling, in a way I had never seen before. And then he was pulling me closer, his hands framing my face with exquisite tenderness. He kissed me there on the terrace, in front of God and society and everyone who had ever doubted the reality of our marriage. It was not a chaste, public appropriate kiss. It was passionate and desperate and full of months of suppressed longing. When we finally broke apart, breathless and shaking, the assembled crowd erupted in applause and laughter. The scandal we had created was enormous. By tomorrow, every drawing room in London would be discussing the Duke and Duchess of Stirling's dramatic declaration of love at their own ball. But for once in my carefully controlled life, I did not care about propriety or reputation or what society thought. Because Alexander was looking at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered, and the contract that had brought us together, with all its careful clauses and protections, had finally been revealed for what it truly was, a meaningless document that could never have prevented what we were always meant to become. The ball continued for several more hours after our terrace declaration, though I remembered very little of it. Alexander and I moved through the remaining festivities in a daze, his hand never far from mine, our eyes meeting constantly across crowded rooms with expressions that needed no translation. The guests departed with knowing smiles and congratulations that felt both sincere and slightly scandalous. We had provided them with the entertainment of the season. A love story emerging from the most unlikely circumstances, complete with public confrontation and passionate declaration. Lady Victoria left early without bidding us farewell, her exit marked by rigid posture and barely concealed fury. I felt a twinge of sympathy for her humiliation, but it was fleeting. She had chosen cruelty, and the consequences were her own. When the last guest finally departed near dawn, Alexander and I stood together in the entrance hall. Suddenly alone after hours of public performance, the house felt enormous and quiet around us, lit only by the dying candles and the first grey light of morning. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The weight of what had happened, what we had confessed, what we had acknowledged, hung in the air between us. Alexander broke the silence first. He asked with uncharacteristic uncertainty if we might talk. Not here, surrounded by the debris of the ball, but somewhere private. I agreed, my heart pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. We walked through the quiet house to the library, our footsteps echoing on marble floors. Someone had left a fire burning low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the shelves of books. Alexander closed the door behind us with careful deliberation. Then he turned to face me, and I saw vulnerability in his expression that took my breath away. This was not the controlled Duke of Stirling, who had proposed a business arrangement 6 months ago. This was Alexander, uncertain, hopeful, and terrifyingly human. He asked if I had meant what I said on the terrace, if I truly felt what I had confessed, or if I had simply been caught up in the moment, responding to his declaration with words I thought he wanted to hear. The question revealed so much about his own insecurities, his difficulty believing that someone could choose him for reasons beyond his title and wealth. I crossed the space between us and took his hands in mine. I told him I had never meant anything more in my entire life, that I had been falling in love with him for months, fighting it every step of the way, because paragraph 4 had promised freedom from exactly this complication. I told him about noticing the small things, his coffee preferences, the scar above his eyebrow, the way his eyes lightened when he was amused, about how, The thoughtful gestures had undone me piece by piece. About lying awake in the East Wing, wondering if he was doing the same in the West Wing, I told him that I had been terrified of these feelings because they violated everything we had agreed to. That I had convinced myself I was alone in this impossible situation. He listened without interrupting, his grip on my hands tightening as I spoke. When I finished, he raised one hand to cup my face, with such tenderness that tears sprang to my eyes. He told me I had never been alone, that he had been equally terrified, equally convinced that he was violating the terms we had established. He explained that the contract had been his idea because he had been hurt before. A woman in his youth who had seemed to care for him genuinely, only to reveal that she wanted his title and nothing more. The experience had convinced him that emotional connections were impossible for someone in his position, that anyone claiming to care for him was simply performing for material gain. So he had designed our marriage to avoid that pain. No expectations, no pretense, a purely practical arrangement where everyone's motivations were transparent. But I had surprised him from the beginning. The way I accepted the terms without trying to negotiate for more. The intelligence and kindness I displayed in managing his household. The lack of any attempt to manipulate or control him. He had started paying attention despite his best intentions, noticing my preferences, finding excuses to spend time at home rather than at his club, purchasing books he thought I might enjoy and pretending it was coincidence when they appeared. The incident with the teacup had shattered his carefully maintained distance. The awareness that our hands touching could send electricity through his entire body had been devastating to his planned emotional detachment. He had tried to reinforce the boundaries, to remember why he had created them, to convince himself that what he felt was merely appreciation for a pleasant companion. But watching Lord Hartfield touch me at the Morrison reception had revealed the truth. The possessive fury he had felt was not the reaction of a man satisfied with a business arrangement. It was jealousy, pure and consuming. From that moment, he had been fighting a losing battle against feelings that grew stronger every day. Lady Victoria's campaign had been simultaneously the worst and best thing that could have happened. It had forced him to acknowledge what he wanted, not just to protect his reputation, but to claim me as genuinely his. Not because of a contract, but because his heart refused to accept any other outcome. As he spoke, I watched emotions play across his face with unprecedented openness. This was what I had wanted without realizing it. Not the controlled duke, but the man beneath the title, with all his fears and hopes and complicated history. When he finished, I asked the question that had been tormenting me for weeks. I asked about Lady Victoria, about their history. Alexander's expression turned rueful. He explained that Victoria had pursued him aggressively for years before our marriage. He had never encouraged her attentions, had, in fact, made it clear he had no interest in a romantic connection with her or anyone else. His marriage to me had apparently been perceived as a betrayal by her. Not because she loved him, he clarified, but because she had wanted the position of Duchess of Stirling. His choice of an impoverished nobody over a wealthy, beautiful society fixture had been an insult she could not forgive. Her campaign of rumours had been revenge and an attempt to prove that his unconventional choice was a mistake. The irony, he said with the first hint of humour, was that she had been partially correct. Our marriage had started as a cold transaction. What she had not anticipated was that it would evolve into something neither of us had planned for or protected against. I felt relief wash through me at this explanation, followed immediately by shame at my jealousy. Victoria had never been a threat to our marriage. The only real danger had been our own inability to communicate honestly about what we were feeling. Alexander seemed to read my thoughts. He said that was why he wanted to talk now, before we went any further. to make absolutely certain we understood each other and what we both wanted. He said the contract we had signed was void. Not legally, he would have his solicitor draft proper dissolution papers, but emotionally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. He did not want a marriage based on mutual courtesy, without expectations of affection. He wanted something real, something messy and complicated and entirely unpredictable. He wanted to know everything about me, my thoughts, my fears, my dreams. He wanted to share the same chambers instead of occupying opposite wings. He wanted arguments and reconciliations and all the beautiful chaos of genuine partnership. He wanted, he said with devastating honesty, to build a real marriage with the woman he loved. But only if that was what I wanted too. He would not trap me in something I had not chosen freely. If I preferred the safety of our original arrangement, if the intensity of genuine emotion was more than I could manage, he would find a way to step back, to give me space while still protecting my reputation and my family's security. The offer was so perfectly him, thoughtful, generous, prioritizing my comfort even at cost to himself. It made me love him even more. I told him he was an idiot. That after months of falling in love with him, after confessing those feelings in front of half of London's society, after kissing him on the terrace with an enthusiasm that would fuel gossip for years, did he truly think I wanted to retreat to the cold safety of our original contract? I told him I wanted exactly what he had described, the real marriage with all its complications, the shared chambers, the arguments and reconciliations, the beautiful, terrifying uncertainty of building something together without knowing exactly where it would lead. I told him I loved him, simply, directly, with no hedging or qualification. His smile in response was incandescent. Then he was kissing me again, and this time there was no audience, no need to maintain any pretense, just the two of us, finally honest about what we wanted and free to act on it. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, Alexander suggested we should probably get some sleep. It had been a very long night, and we would need to face the social consequences of our public declaration eventually. But first, he said with endearing hesitation, there was something he wanted to do. He crossed to his desk and retrieved the marriage contract from a locked drawer. The document that had governed our relationship for 6 months. The carefully worded agreement that had seemed so sensible and protective. He brought it to the fireplace where embers still glowed. Then he looked at me, clearly asking permission. I nodded, and together we fed the pages to the dying fire. We watched as the paper, caught and burned, the carefully drafted paragraphs curling and blackening. Paragraph 4. Both parties agree to maintain conduct of mutual courtesy without demands of an intimate nature or expectations of affection. Dissolved into ash and smoke, it was deeply symbolic and slightly melodramatic, and absolutely perfect. When the last page had burned, Alexander pulled me close. He said we should write a new agreement, not a legal contract, but promises to each other about the marriage we wanted to build. So there, in the library, as dawn broke over Stirling House, we crafted our real vows. We promised to talk honestly about our feelings, even when it was difficult, to trust each other enough to be vulnerable, to choose connection over safety, to build something together that neither of us could have created alone. We promised to remember that love was not a weakness or a complication, but the very thing that made our partnership worthwhile. And we promised to be patient with ourselves and each other as we learned how to be genuinely married, rather than simply performing the role. These were the vows that mattered, not the ones spoken before a vicar 6 months ago, but the ones whispered in firelight with complete honesty and open hearts. The following weeks brought their own challenges, of course. Society buzzed with speculation about our dramatic declaration. Some viewed it as wildly romantic. Others saw it as confirmation that our marriage had always been unstable. My mother wrote, expressing equal parts delight and concern. Charlotte sent an embarrassingly enthusiastic letter demanding every detail. We received invitations from people who had previously kept their distance, curious about this unconventional couple who had turned a business arrangement into a love match. Alexander and I navigated it all together, really together, for the first time. We moved my belongings from the East Wing to his chambers in the West Wing, sleeping beside him, waking to find him there, sharing the intimate routines of daily life. It was everything I had secretly wanted, and everything the original contract had been designed to prevent. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. Our conversations ranged from philosophy to gossip, from estate management to childhood memories. I learned about his mother's death and his difficult relationship with his father. He learned about my complicated feelings toward my own father's failures. We had our first real argument 3 weeks after the ball. Something about household management that escalated ridiculously. We both said things we regretted. Then we apologized, talked it through, and discovered that reconciliation could be even more intense than the argument itself. We were learning each other in ways the contract had never permitted. All the messy, wonderful, frustrating, beautiful reality of genuine partnership. One evening, about 2 months after the ball, we were sitting together in the library, my head resting against his shoulder, his arm around my waist, both of us reading in comfortable silence. Alexander set down his book and asked if I ever regretted accepting his original proposal. If I wished I had held out for something more conventional, a courtship leading to a love match from the beginning. I considered the question seriously. The truth was complicated. I told him that I would not change how we had begun, that the contract, for all its coldness, had given us something valuable, time to know each other without performance or expectation. We had built trust and respect before adding love to the foundation. Many marriages started with passion and romance, only to discover they had nothing deeper to sustain them when the initial excitement faded. We had done it backward. We had started with the practical partnership and discovered passion later. Perhaps that made our connection stronger, not weaker. Besides, I said, there was something rather poetic about falling in love with someone you had promised not to care for. About feelings so strong they overcame carefully worded legal protections. Alexander laughed and said he supposed there was a certain romance in that perspective. Then he grew more serious. He said he had something he wanted to give me. He retrieved a small box from his desk drawer and returned to sit beside me. Inside was a ring, not the practical signet I had worn since our wedding, but something far more beautiful. A sapphire surrounded by diamonds set in delicate gold. He explained that he had commissioned it weeks before the ball, before our public declaration, when he was still trying to convince himself his feelings were manageable. The jeweler had finally delivered it that afternoon. He said he knew I already wore his ring, already bore his name, but he wanted to give me something chosen specifically because he loved me, not because a contract required it. I looked at the beautiful ring, then at his face, open and vulnerable and utterly dear. I told him it was perfect, that he was perfect, that somehow, impossibly, we had stumbled into exactly what we both needed. He slipped the new ring onto my finger beside the old one. The contrast was striking, practical duty and chosen love, side by side. It seemed appropriate for us. A reminder of where we had started and how far we had come. That night, as we prepared for bed in our shared chambers, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The elegant Duchess of Stirling, wearing a beautiful gown and jewellery that proclaimed my position. But when I looked closer, I saw something else. The slight smile that never quite left my face anymore. The lightness in my eyes. The way I moved with confidence rather than careful control. I looked like a woman who was loved, a woman who loved in return, a woman who had signed a contract promising mutual courtesy without affection, and had somehow found everything the contract had been designed to prevent. Alexander came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We looked at our reflection together, Duke and Duchess of Stirling, business partners turned genuine lovers, two people who had stumbled into the most improbable happy ending. He asked what I was thinking. I told him the truth, that I had thought our marriage was just a contract, a practical solution to practical problems. I had been spectacularly, wonderfully wrong. Our marriage was not just a contract. It was a choice we made every day, a partnership built on trust and respect and genuine affection, a love story that had started with the most unromantic proposal imaginable and had somehow evolved into everything I had never known I wanted. The contract had brought us together. Love had made us stay. And paragraph 4, that careful protection against emotional complications, had been rendered beautifully, completely irrelevant by the simple fact that the heart refuses to be governed by legal documents. Alexander kissed my temple and said he loved me. I turned in his arms and told him I loved him too. These were words we said freely now, without fear or hesitation. Words that would have violated our original agreement, but that defined our real marriage. Outside, London slept beneath summer stars. Inside Stirling House, two people who had promised each other nothing but courtesy had discovered something far more valuable. We had discovered that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, that love can grow in the most unlikely soil, that a marriage of convenience can become the greatest romance of all. I had entered this arrangement believing I was sacrificing the possibility of love for the security of my family. Instead, I had found a partner who challenged me, respected me, and loved me with an intensity that took my breath away. The contract we had signed was ash and memory. The marriage we had built was real and strong and entirely our own. And as Alexander led me toward our bed, his hand warm in mine, his eyes full of promises that no legal document could ever capture, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. Not when I accepted his original proposal, but every day since, when I chose to love him despite every reason not to. When I chose vulnerability over safety. When I chose real connection over convenient distance. When I chose us over the carefully worded protections of paragraph 4. Our marriage had started as just a contract, but it had become so much more. It had become everything.